On May 3, 2025, Texas Governor Greg Abbott passed the Texas Education Freedom Act, a bill to, quote, empower Texas families to choose the education pathway that is best for their child. The bill promises roughly $10,000 per year for general students to use towards private school tuition, fees, tutoring, and transportation. Children with disabilities can receive up to $30,000. At first glance, this sounds like a win for low-income families. They get more educational choices and a better opportunity to escape struggling schools. But there's another side to this story. The money funding this program comes from the Texas state budget, not from a new tax. They've kept their basic public school funding allotment essentially flat since 2019, despite years of inflation, but lawmakers somehow found $1 billion to launch a voucher program. That's $1 billion that could have been used to raise teacher pay, preserve academic programs, reduce class sizes, or help the districts close these growing budget gaps. But the even deeper concern is that these vouchers often don't even cover the full cost of private education. Many private schools charge tuition well above $10,000 per year, meaning the families most able to benefit are often those who could already afford at least part of a private school education. In fact, it's estimated that up to 20% of the program's initial $1 billion budget could flow to wealthier families who earn 500% or more of the poverty rate. Meanwhile, public schools still educate the overwhelming majority of Texas children. If resources continue to shift towards private school subsidies while public school funding stagnates, the students left behind may face even fewer opportunities than they do today. But focusing solely on Texas would miss the bigger picture. The Texas Freedom Act is merely a small representation of a growing trend of educational disparity in America. For decades, Americans have been told that education is the great equalizer. We provide the institutions that give a child born into poverty the same opportunity to succeed as a child born into privilege. But I think most of us know by now that the reality of our education system looks very different. Among developed nations, the United States has one of the most unequal school funding systems in the world. We have one of the highest child poverty rates among countries in the OECD, surpassed only by Israel and Costa Rica. And while many other industrialized countries distribute educational resources in ways that reduce disparities between rich and poor communities, America's system often does the opposite. Public schools in the US are among the most inequitably funded of any industrialized nation, due in large part to reliance on property taxes. Only 18 states provide at least 10% more funding to high poverty districts than low poverty districts. To understand why this happens, we need to understand how American schools are funded. Most people assume that public education is primarily funded by the federal government. In reality, federal funding accounts for only about 14% of K-12 education revenue. The majority comes from state and local sources, with local property taxes alone accounting for roughly 1/3 of all public school funding. On the surface, that might seem perfectly reasonable. Communities invest in their schools and everyone benefits. The problem is that property wealth isn't distributed evenly. Imagine two school districts that impose the exact same property tax rate. One serves a wealthy suburb filled with million-dollar homes and thriving businesses. The other serves a low-income community with much less valuable property. Even though both districts are taxing themselves at the same rate, the wealthy district will generate dramatically more revenue. In theory, state governments are supposed to offset these disparities through funding formulas that direct more resources towards schools with greater needs, but in practice, those efforts are often incomplete. As a result, many high-poverty districts are forced to educate students with fewer resources despite facing greater challenges. And the problem has only become more pronounced over time. According to a 2024 analysis by the Education Law Center, while most states experienced growth in both education revenue and GDP over the last decade, economic growth frequently outpaced investment in public education. In other words, many states became wealthier without making a proportional investment in their public schools. So what happens when students with the greatest needs consistently attend the schools with the fewest resources? Well, one answer can be found in America's report card. Since 2019, reading scores have fallen across nearly every demographic group in the country. 4th grade reading scores dropped 5 points. 8th grade reading scores dropped 5 points as well, falling to their lowest level in decades. But averages don't tell the full story. When researchers broke down the results, they found that the lowest performing students experienced substantially larger declines than the highest performing students. The gap between America's strongest and weakest students has continued to widen, creating what some education researchers have called a two-track education system. If the highest performing students were falling at the same rate as everyone else, this would simply be an education crisis. But the students losing the most ground are disproportionately the students already facing the greatest obstacles. According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, 4th grade students who are eligible for the National School Lunch Program, a common measure of economic disadvantage, scored 28 points lower in reading than students who were not eligible. By 8th grade, the gap remained enormous at 24 points. The same pattern appears in mathematics. Economically disadvantaged 4th graders scored 24 points lower than their more affluent peers, while the gap among 8th graders was 31 points. On the NAEP scale, researchers often consider roughly 10 points the equivalent to 1 year of learning. So in some subjects, we're looking at gaps that represent multiple academic years. And the disparities become even more striking when race enters the picture. In 2024, white 4th grade students scored 27 points higher than black students in reading and 25 points higher than Hispanic students. By 8th grade, white students scored 24 points higher than black students and 22 points higher than Hispanic students. Math scores, again, are reflected in a similar way. White 4th grade students outscored black students by 31 points and Hispanic students by 24 points. And while race and income aren't the same thing, they often overlap because poverty remains unevenly distributed throughout American society. Now this brings us back to the schools themselves, because high poverty schools already face a ton of challenges that extend way beyond academics. Students are more likely to experience food insecurity, housing instability, neighborhood violence, and limited access to healthcare. And yet, despite serving students with greater needs, high poverty districts receive fewer resources than wealthier districts. But regardless of class, one thing is certain: nobody is reading enough these days. The fact that 54% of adults have a literacy below a 6th grade level and daily reading for pleasure dropped 40% in the past 2 decades is deeply concerning. I know how much more mentally sharp I've felt since reading daily for the past couple years, and that's one of the biggest reasons why I decided to write my debut novel, Echoes Across Infinity. Echoes Across Infinity is a story about a 21-year-old named Elliot who lives in the modern world, our post-pandemic world, who loses his mother through an unexplainable accident. Through the trauma he endures, he begins to have uncontrollable visions, which he soon discovers are glimpses into a parallel reality he can learn to access. It's a blend of sci-fi, psychology, and philosophy, and the first Amazon reviewer actually said that they almost finished the entire book in one sitting. Shout out to that guy. So if the themes of grief, identity, loneliness, and human connection resonate with you, you can pick up the book by going to the first link in the description or scanning the QR code that you see on screen right now. Unfortunately, academic achievement isn't the only area where disadvantaged students are falling behind. Another growing problem is chronic absenteeism. A student is considered chronically absent when they miss at least 10% of the school year, about 18 days in a typical school calendar. Before the pandemic, about 15% of students nationwide were chronically absent, but by 2022, that figure had almost doubled to roughly 28%. That translates to millions of students missing it nearly a month of school or more per year, and like many of the trends we've discussed so far, this problem isn't evenly distributed. Students from low-income families are significantly more likely to be chronically absent than their wealthier peers. Schools serving high-poverty communities have experienced some of the largest increases in absenteeism since the pandemic, creating yet another obstacle for students already facing greater challenges outside the classroom. And the consequences of this are difficult to overstate. Research consistently shows that chronically absent students are less likely to read proficiently by 3rd grade, more likely to fall behind academically, and significantly more likely to drop out before graduating high school. Think about what this means. If a student misses just 2 days a month, they're missing nearly an entire month of instruction every year. After several years, those losses are going to compound and create this vicious cycle where coursework becomes more difficult, then school becomes more frustrating, and then attendance declines even further, which just reinforces the cycle. And when chronic absenteeism concentrates in already struggling schools, the challenges that teachers face become even greater. It's difficult to improve reading scores, math scores, graduation rates, or college readiness when a substantial portion of students simply aren't in the classroom consistently enough to learn. And that leads to another problem that public schools are simultaneously dealing with: a shrinking teacher workforce. According to data from the Economic Policy Institute, public schools lost more than 100,000 teaching positions during the Great Recession. More than a decade later, many districts were still struggling to rebuild that workforce. Then came the pandemic, which accelerated burnout, early retirements, and teacher turnover across the country. Today, teacher shortages affect the vast majority of states. In a 2023 survey conducted by the National Center for Education Statistics, 86% of public schools reported difficulties hiring teachers for the 2023-24 school year. Nearly half reported feeling understaffed entering the school year. And of course, these shortages are not distributed evenly. Schools serving low-income communities consistently report greater difficulty recruiting and retaining teachers than wealthier districts. When districts lack the resources to offer competitive salaries or manageable class sizes, attracting experienced teachers becomes increasingly difficult, and these experienced teachers are incredibly important for a myriad of different reasons. Research has repeatedly shown that teacher effectiveness tends to improve significantly during the first several years in the classroom. Students taught by more experienced teachers generally achieve stronger academic outcomes than those taught by novice teachers, particularly in schools serving disadvantaged populations. And in some districts, the problem has become severe enough that schools have increasingly relied on long-term substitutes or teachers working outside their area of expertise just to keep classrooms staffed. For students already struggling with poverty and absenteeism and lower academic achievement, teacher instability just becomes another hurdle they gotta jump over to get towards upward mobility. Another piece of this puzzle that's not talked about regularly are school counselors. The American School Counselor Association recommends a ratio of 250 students per counselor. The national average is closer to 376 to 1, and in some states exceeds 600 to 1. For many students, counselors are the people helping them select courses, navigate personal challenges, apply for scholarships, complete college applications, and plan for life after graduation. Now, I want you to imagine two students with identical talent and work ethic. One attends a school where counselors have enough time to meet with students regularly. The other attends a school where a single counselor is responsible for hundreds upon hundreds of students. Which student is more likely to learn about scholarship opportunities? Which student is more likely to receive guidance on college admissions? Which student is more likely to be noticed when they're struggling? And then there's the opportunities that don't even appear on transcripts, like the debate clubs or the robotics team or theater production. These are the programs that help students build confidence and leadership skills that lead to them pursuing professional networks. And yet, these are often the first programs that get cut when budget becomes strained. And when these cuts are accumulating year after year, they begin to shape the trajectory of a person's life. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, Cole, just how big of a role does money play in these things? Because there's a lot of other things plaguing the education system, right? We have the rise of AI and a lot more students using that, and it's also affecting their literacy habits. Another thing affecting their literacy habits is social media and having smartphones in the classrooms and trying to tackle that addiction while also juggling schoolwork. And then we have the structures of the families themselves that could be playing a role in all of these disparities. So just how heavily does funding play a role? Well, when researchers have studied major changes in school funding, the results are very consistent. One of the clearest examples came after the pandemic. Between 2022 and 2024, high-need districts that received larger allocations generally experienced stronger improvements in both reading and math than comparable districts receiving less funding. Districts that invested more heavily in interventions such as tutoring programs and summer learning opportunities saw particularly strong gains. Perhaps more encouragingly, researchers found that the achievement gap between high poverty and low poverty districts narrowed by approximately 1 month of learning during this period, equivalent to the amount the gap had widened between 2019 and 2022. The same thing happens with long-running federal programs. For decades, Title I funding has directed additional resources towards schools serving large numbers of low-income students. And researchers have linked these investments to higher educational attainment, increased high school graduation rates, higher earnings and work hours in adulthood, and lower rates of poverty, incarceration, and school suspensions. And even increasing funding on the state level, which has been shown to generally not have as big of an impact on these outcomes, produces great results. So if the research is abundantly clear, the question then becomes, what can we do about it? Well, the first step is to understand your state's funding system. Every state funds schools differently. Some rely more heavily on local property taxes. Some do a better job directing extra money towards high poverty districts. Tools like the Education Trust State of Education Funding Database allow you to look up your own state and see whether funding is being distributed progressively, regressively, or somewhere in between. Next, find out who represents you in your state legislature. See whether your state provides more resources to high poverty districts or less. Then contact your representatives with a specific demand. Support a funding formula that provides more resources to districts serving low-income students. The second step is paying attention to school board elections. School boards decide how much district money is spent and influence staffing, curriculum, facilities, transportation, almost all of it. These elections are often low turnout, which means that even a small number of organized voters can have an outsized influence. The third step is supporting organizations that are already doing this work. The Education Law Center, who published the Making the Grade report, tracks state school funding systems and support legal and policy efforts to make school funding more adequate and equitable. The Learning Policy Institute provides research on how school funding affects student outcomes and what kinds of investments actually work. Public Funds Public Schools specifically works against diverting public dollars into private school voucher programs. And if you want to focus on students facing the harshest barriers, organizations like Schoolhouse Connection advocate for students experiencing homelessness, helping protect federal programs that support school stability, attendance, and graduation. And the fourth step is pushing for policies that the research actually supports. That means competitive teacher pay, smaller class sizes where they matter the most, more counselors, more tutoring, more early childhood education, more advanced coursework for schools that have historically lacked it. The goal should be to spend money in ways that expand opportunity. And so now that brings us back to Texas. Some lower-income families may genuinely benefit from the voucher program. For a small portion of them, access to a different school may genuinely improve their educational experience. But if education is supposed to be the great equalizer, we cannot keep building a system where the children born with the least are asked to succeed with the least. Let me know your thoughts as always in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, you'll probably like my video about America's literacy crisis, focusing specifically on that, and like I mentioned like halfway through this video, if you're interested in picking up a book that I think reads fast and is a fun story and provides a lot of lessons, especially if you're like a young guy, young adult, then definitely check out Echoes Across Infinity, link in the description to that, and now I'm leaving. Goodbye.